Okay, so let me ask you, what did we come up with? Because there was a lot of enthusiastic talk. I was humbled to hear it, quite honestly. Thinking about the intersection of where these four quadrants of types of data intersect. What are some rich sources of questions? Yeah.
Mark, I talked about, and I talked to you about, the perception performance overlap, especially from special ed. In my school, I just think the special ed teachers are sending out a message that they're special ed kids and they can't do it.
Wow. Wow.
Yep.
Normally, when you talk about perceptions, you think about parent perceptions. In this case, we're talking about teacher perceptions. What an important variable. If our teachers can't believe that the kids can do it, or if they don't believe the kids can do it, how can anyone else? Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
And that's where the data is important, because I taught an inclusion class one year, and that was what the teacher said to me when she walked in. She said, just so you know, we're gonna start off, this is how I met the teacher. She said, my kids can't do this, so, you know, good luck with that.
Nice to meet you.
I said, well, yes, they can, and we're gonna get started, and by the end of the school year, she believed it, because
Yeah.
she saw it. She saw that they could answer open-ended questions, so that's why this data, the proof is there.
Yeah.
Once she saw the growth, it changed her mindset, but they have to see it to believe it sometimes.
And, you know, I can't stress enough the power of anonymous surveys. There are so many there's so much charge when you talk about people's perceptions of things. There's so many landmines, especially when you're talking about a principal-teacher relationship. So conducting anonymous research as a principal, casual research amongst your own people, is so important, because it's so important to get an honest assessment of where you are. Later on, we're going to talk about taking a hard look at where we are, point A versus point B. It's absolutely, absolutely essential to get honest responses about things. So Troy, if you ask people face to face, you know, do you think your kids can do it? I can't imagine that they're going to tell you no. Maybe Beth, you did have that experience, but I think
Body language tells you all you need to know.
that's a good point. That's a good point. Where else did we see some interesting overlap? Yeah.
With demographics and perception. Often those kids that walk into your room that look different from the general community, teacher perception is often, you know, skewed by that.
Yeah.
And or even performance. We have kids who come into kindergarten who can read already, and the teacher thinks, all right, let's do the alphabet. And it's not constructive.
Yeah, absolutely. What else?
We have in our school a lot of support programs, especially for our bilingual students who have ESL, LLI, recovery, things like that. So we're always looking at, are these programs really helping students? Because then when we look at individual students and how many rounds of LLI they have to have in order to.
What's LLI? Just
Level literacy intervention is through Fountas and Pinnell. So, you know, we're looking at some classrooms with a lot of support where children are still not getting to where they need to be.
yeah.
So we're looking at like, okay, now what else do we do? Because you can't stop until it's not working, so forget it.
Right. I give up and trust. No. Exactly, exactly. So you're balancing process there too. Process, remember, think of process as input. What are we doing as professionals? Okay, actually, I'm gonna jump ahead. I was gonna do this later, but this is an easier way, I think, to think of the four types of data. Who are we? Demographics. What are we doing? What are we as professionals doing every day from 7 to 4:30? How are we doing? What kind of results are we getting? And how are we perceived? Those, I think, are easier ways to approach the four types of data. It's the same thing, it's just easier to understand questions. Where else do we see some overlap?
I see it really between perceptions and performance, because I think based on our perceptions, we may limit our expectations when it comes to performance. And sometimes when the data supports what we already feel, we're just getting, I think a lot of people get into this cycle, well, this is what we're dealing with, we don't have this, we don't have that, and it doesn't impact and affect performance.
Yeah, you say when people see what they already think. What do you mean?
When the data doesn't, when they don't perform as we expect them to perform or want them to perform, it just justifies some of our preconceived perceptions.
Okay.
And we've actually already built in how they were going to perform in that test long ago.
I see, yes.
Well, just like tapping onto that, that the reason why we are focused schools because of the gap between the highest and lowest achieving subgroups,
Demographic.
highest being the Asian,
Mhm.
lowest Latino, and Hispanic. So, you know, already people's like, oh, of course, the Asians are gonna
Okay.
outperform.
That's the intersection of demographics, perceptions, and performance, so it's like right
Yeah.
here. Yeah, absolutely.
But then we have to look at the process. What are we doing, you know, to make sure that, because everybody learns differently, you know, and there's research that shows that different subgroups learn differently.
Mhm.
You know, we know our Asian children are going home to parents who are pushing them. They don't take
How do we know that?
because they tell us.
Perfect. That's the easiest way of data collection you could ever have. Somebody says, here's your data. Yep, they tell us, exactly. What if you didn't know? You couldn't make that assumption.
No, you can't, right.
And that's an important thing, because what you almost did, I'm not saying you almost did it, but what someone could have almost done was fallen into the exact trap you're talking about. By saying, well, we know our Asian kids are going to go home and get a good education from their parents. How do we know that?
And it's not
In your
that-
case, it's because they told you.
It's not that their parents are definitely helping them, but they limit like social activities. You know, so they're not out in the streets hanging out. They are home, and it's a very strict environment that they have when they get home. And then, you know, the parents are not accepting even Bs. You know, their children don't come home with As. Or if they have a child that is not doing well, just had a conversation with a parent whose son is really not doing well and he's Asian. The father, true in his culture, does not want to accept that here's my son who is not picking up.
No consequences. Absolutely. So what NCLB forced us to do was take a look at who are we and how are we doing. So demographics and performance. That was all that was really on the menu, was male-female, performance, ethnicity, performance. That was the most important thing. What we're doing is going much deeper than that. What else? Let's take two more. Yeah.
And feeding in on demographics, perceptions, and performance, I feel that sometimes whether it's the systems we have in place, our process, or even our infrastructure, actually might be the root causes as to why our students aren't performing.
What do you mean the infrastructure is the root of performance? Can you give an example?
Maybe the manner in which we do classroom, the way we have our district set up school-wise, or the time of day we start maybe at 3. There are a lot of different things we have in place that feed into all of those things.
I think it's hard sometimes to not come back to performance, because ultimately what are we in the business of? Student learning. And we're always thinking about measuring student learning. You know, performance is at the bottom as the base for a reason. It's because that's really what we're in the business of. If we were a true business, we would be looking at our bottom line. Yeah, the other stuff's great, but what we really want to know is what's our bottom line. Well, in education, performance is our bottom line. Now, you know, I'll talk to you all day long if you want to about what standardized tests show versus creativity and all that other stuff. But the reality of our system in the state is that we are beholden to certain performance metrics, i.e. the state tests. So that is normally what we're talking about. Let's take one more observation on this. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on my colleague, we were talking as a group the other day, we visited one of our schools, it's a priority school. And what we discussed was, since we have such mobility in our district, that it would benefit our district if we did like some of the other school districts have already done, a K1 and 2 building, a 3, 4, and 5, our kids are then getting consistency. So that's where all that plays, and if you have these discussions based on data, we know that that high mobility rate is there and it's affecting learning in a negative way. So then why can't we discuss ways to use that data to improve our district and make it better for our kids so they are successful? So
Yeah.
maybe just think of that conversation.
So for instance, we may have a 50, what's the mobility rate in your school? 70%.
Mobility rate?
Yes, okay. Some schools.
There's a piece of great data collection, by the way.
Okay, so, and if you go through School Digger, which I think is one of your links, you can actually find a lot of this information. but in one school we may have 70% mobility rate, in another school we have 12, in another school we have 30, in another school we have, why is this happening? When you go to the middle school where all the schools come together and they have, Dr. Denny,
Yeah,
we
we don't
have
have-
like a 12% mobility
Yeah.
rate,
Yeah.
because that's inter-district mobility.
Mhm,
Right.
mhm.
So by all these schools, in front, he's a priority school, they got 70% mobility. Last year, you had, what, 200 kids in, 200 kids out.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
these kids are coming in with a lot of academic gaps because they're moving around so much. If we can reduce that rate
Right.
by 30%, you know, we're reducing the number of academic learning gaps they have.
Absolutely. So, you know, if, Dr. Day, if I can use your school as a guinea pig, if you are now a middle school principal and you have 5 elementary schools with mobility rates somewhere between 0 and 70%, which, or maybe even a little bit higher, now an interesting piece of data is how well do my students from various mobility rates perform? And if you see that the kids who have who are from schools where there's 70% mobility rate come in at a gap, that's something that it empowers you. Whatever you do about it, that's almost a separate conversation. Just knowing that empowers you. Harry, as a school where 70% of your kids are moving around, if you didn't know that, and you're operating your school like it's a school, you know, I dare say a regular school that doesn't have a 70% mobility rate, you're operating in the dark. You're feeling around in the dark. Yeah.
So if you were to do a bar graph, and you rank your schools by mobility rate, and then you rank your schools by proficiency rate,
Yep.
you're going to see very similar trends. I'm not saying there is a causal effect there,
Mhm.
but the data, as you said, the data is a good indicator.
Absolutely. But there's correlation. You know, later on I'm going to show you the data site. We talked about correlation versus causation. So you can make some really funny jokes about those things, which I'd be happy to share with you after this is done. So I don't bore people who don't find me funny. But one of the things that I do want to talk about is that causation, there's almost nothing in social science that we can say, that's the cause, we proved it. All we have are correlations. If I teach this way, and I get all 50%, and then the next year I teach that way, and I get all 90%, I can't say it's because of the way I taught. I just can't. There's no proof. Proofs are for abstract algebra. I can say there's an awfully high correlation, and you know what? That's okay. That's okay, because in life, that's what there are. There are very few things in life that can be proven. It's about high correlation, and that's, you know, the phrase good enough has bad connotations, but in this case it shouldn't. That's good enough. That is good enough to move forward. So yeah, so if there are high correlations, it's when the correlations stop or when they're not high that you have to ask some follow-up questions. Okay, so here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to, before I move ahead, first page of your packet is asking questions of your data. I heard, if I could quantify the punctuation marks I just heard more question marks than periods, quite honestly. There were so many questions that you all asked of what was going on in your school that I knew everybody here was on the right track. Data really is about questions and their answers. So before you start collecting data, you have to have a question in mind, okay? So what I want you to do is think of questions, 2 questions each, for each of the 4 kinds of data, and then jot down the data you need to collect. We'll do this for 5-10 minutes. I have an anecdote to share, and then we'll take a break. So if you feel like it's break time, it's coming, just hang in there. Okay? Yeah.